Today we'll be discussing food waste and sustainability. The topics we'll be talking about include how much do we waste, sustainability in food, sustainability on a budget, and lastly we'll be looking at some tips for limiting food waste. So to begin, how much do we waste? And the simple answer to that is a lot. So each Canadian alone generates approximately 2.7 kilograms of garbage every single day. And in total as a country, that equates to millions and millions of tons of industrial waste every single year. In addition to just industrial waste, at this time, we're also wasting a lot of COVID vaccines, which could be definitely used elsewhere. So we're definitely wasting a lot of stuff, including food waste. And if you look at the little infographic on the right, you can see a bunch of different food groups that are most common that we waste. We also have environmental and industrial waste and household waste, and all of that put together impacts our environment and our quality of living. So to look a bit further into food, how much food are we wasting in Canada? Approximately 79 kilograms of food are wasted per household each year. And together, approximately 58% of all the food that we produce is wasted, and that equates to around 35.5 million tons every year. And as shown on the right in that infographic, that 35.5 million tons is equal to about 95 times the weight of the CN Tower. And along with that, you can find some other sad but important information about food waste here in Canada. And along with that, of that waste, 32% of it could be better used as rescue and used to support communities across Canada. So why is this a problem, you're wondering? Food waste in Canada is equivalent to having an extra 2.1 million cars on the road. So if you just think about that, that is a significant problem that we're having. And to look a bit further into these problems, one, it's very costly. Per household, it's estimated that we are spending an extra just under $2,000 every single year on food that's being wasted. And as a country as a whole, it's equaling about $31 billion of food waste, and that's around 40% of the food that's being produced. Additionally, there are very significant environmental impacts. As you can imagine, it is very big on reducing resources. As we take food and waste it, it really hurts the supply chain, and all the food that's going out is being wasted. Additionally, as we waste food, it goes out and is taken to landfills and other methods of disposal, ultimately ends up producing greenhouse gases, which contribute to climate change. So who is wasting? I think when we think about food waste as a whole, we tend to blame others, and we often look at the supply chain and the industrial side of things. But as we see from this diagram here, us, the consumers, are actually wasting the majority of the food, equaling about 47%, while processors are only wasting around 20%, retail stores 10%, and as you can see along the line, all the other industrial places are far less significant than the waste we produce ourselves.
All right, so now that we understand the enormity of the amount of food that we waste in Canada, how can we be more sustainable with respect to our food choices? There are many different ways that this can be done. So one of the more well-known ways to be more sustainable is to waste less food. Not only does wasted food take up less space in landfills, but it also wastes all the energy that was put into producing and transporting that food. For example, growing food will take energy and water and will create pollution due to emissions from farming equipment that are used. Then pollution is created in the transport of the food from where it was grown to a processing plant. Often the food will be wrapped in plastic or packaged in a way that also creates waste. After all this, the food is then transported to the store, which again will use more energy and create more pollution in the form of emissions. Finally, the food will then be purchased and transported to its final destination. When food is thrown away instead of eaten, all the energy that went into producing, packing, and transporting the food is also wasted, as well as the packaging and the food, which create more waste that will fill up landfills and create garbage. One of the simplest ways to be more sustainable with your food choices is to only buy what you can eat. Some ways to do this is to create a meal plan so you know what you need to buy each week. to check your fridge before you go shopping to make sure that you are not buying things that you already have, and to make sure to cook with perishable items a couple of days after you buy them. Furthermore, if there are leftovers, freezing them can be a great way to ensure that they don't go bad, and it can give you an already prepared meal for a day when there isn't time to cook. Another way to be more sustainable is to be mindful of what you eat. Some foods create much less emissions and are much more sustainable than other foods. For example, it is known that meat takes much more energy to produce than plant protein. This makes sense because to produce meat, we need to feed and water the animals for years, whereas for vegetables and plant protein, such as beans and lentils, they can be grown and sent directly to humans to be eaten. The two least sustainable foods are lamb and beef, which produce over 8 times and 5 times more emissions per kilogram than a plant protein such as lentils. Some other foods that are known to be less sustainable are cheese, pork, farm salmon, and chicken. Wild seafood and chicken are 2 of the most sustainable forms of animal protein, but these still do not compare to the sustainability of a plant-based diet. Another thing to consider is where the food you eat comes from. Local food is much more sustainable than food that is grown from far away. Consider how less emissions would be needed to transport food to a farmer's market from a local farm compared to transporting produce from the other side of the world. This is why choosing local, in-season produce can help you make more sustainable food choices. Furthermore, buying from smaller family-owned farms can be more sustainable, as these farms often use less pesticides, less polluting machinery, and are usually more environmentally responsible. An added benefit to this method is that the food you will be eating will likely be fresher, contain less pesticides, and be healthier. While this may seem like a lot to remember, taking the time to look into and practicing sustainable food choices is not only better for the environment, but it can also be better for your health and help you make more mindful food choices.
So the question becomes, can you be sustainable on a budget? And we usually tend to equate sustainability with a form of luxury or something we can't afford. But while some sustainable products can be on the pricier side, it's actually very possible for you to be sustainable on a budget. And we're going to talk about some tips in the upcoming slides. So these are just some tips. We've already touched on a couple, but I'm just wanting to reinforce some of the key concepts here. So the first thing is shop local. Get your produce from farmers markets or produce markets. These types of places will generally have cheaper options for getting fresher produce, and you're also supporting local farmers, and that's a great aspect in terms of sustainability. The second thing is to plan ahead and buy in bulk. So look at your grocery list, plan ahead for what you're going to need to use. That'll limit you spending on additional items when you don't have a plan of action when you're going into a grocery store. And the other thing you can do is buy non-perishable food items in bulk. For example, your grains like quinoa and rice can be purchased in bulk, lentils can be purchased in bulk, so can things like chickpeas, dried chickpeas, or dried beans. And then the next thing is to make use of seasonal produce. So buy what's in season, as it's more likely to be of better quality and available to you at a lower price. So for example, we have fall coming up, so things like pumpkin and squash might be great options for you to buy as they'll be in season. Whereas over the summer, you can really make use of the berries and peaches that might be available and purchase those instead. And the next thing is, don't stress about organic food. So we often hear that organic is better, but the actual research about this is pretty mixed. So there isn't enough research to suggest that organic is technically superior to other forms of food. So if organic food is outside of your price range, don't stress about it. By buying local produce in season, you're actually probably getting the best bang for your buck. So try to focus on that instead. And the next thing, which we've already mentioned, is try to go for plant proteins where possible, things like beans and greens. And finally, work on reducing the food waste. We've already talked about how that's really costly when you look at the budget over a year. So by limiting your waste, you're automatically going to be more sustainable in the way you're spending on the food that you're actually consuming. So just a cost comparison for plant versus animal products. So something like rolled oats costs about 0.7 cents per gram per protein. Dried beans and chickpeas is 1.1 cents per gram per protein. Dried lentils 1.6 cents. Brown rice 1.9 cents. And then you compare that to the animal counterparts. Things like steak, ground beef, ham, chicken, all which have a higher monetary value associated with it. So you're paying something like 4.5 cents per gram per protein in comparison to perhaps 1.1 cents per gram per protein. So this just kind of breaks down how not only are animal products less sustainable, they can also be more expensive. So if you're trying to go on a budget, trying to switch up your proteins so that they're more plant-based is a more sustainable option and a more cost-effective option for you as well. So now let's discuss some tips to reduce your waste. The first thing is don't overbuy. So make sure you're really cognizant of the amounts you're buying. For example, if you're going to a Costco or a Whole Foods warehouse and you're buying things in bulk, make sure you're not buying things that are perishable in bulk, things like produce that could go bad and you might end up wasting it. And what goes hand in hand with that is looking at a use by date rather than a best before date. So people tend to think best before date means that you can't use the produce or the item of food after that. And that's actually not true in a lot of cases. So try to think of a used by date. So I have to use this produce by this date, and keep that in mind when you're shopping for it. If you are going to pick up some tomatoes and you don't think you're going to be able to use them by their use by date, then don't buy quite as many. The next thing is using your freezer. So if you get fresh produce, you could batch cook it and then preserve those types of meals by freezing them in your freezer. You could also preserve prepared produce, so doing all of the prep work and then freezing it, and this helps you avoid wasting. The next is to get creative with your leftovers and food scraps, and we have a couple of examples in the upcoming slides on how you can do that. Next is plan your meals where possible. So think about the meals you want to eat in the week, plan them out, and then make your grocery list accordingly. So you're being really efficient with the way that you're approaching this grocery shopping, and that'll ensure that you're buying what you need. Finally, there's composting your scraps and then keeping food that produces ethylene. So this is a chemical compound. It's produced by things like bananas, pears, tomatoes, and this can actually enhance ripening. So it can cause food to spoil a little more early. So you want to keep bananas, pears, and tomatoes away from things that are sensitive to ethylene. So things like potatoes, peppers, or leafy greens. So we've mentioned greenhouse gas emissions across the supply chain. So I just want to reinforce this concept by encouraging you to think about the sources of your food. So looking at something like beef, which emits a lot of greenhouse gases in its production, and getting it into a store for you to be able to buy it, versus something like soy milk, cassava, peas, bananas, all that emit less greenhouse gases. So think about the source of your food when you're thinking about reducing your waste as well. So these are a couple of food saving hacks that you can try. So we have fall coming up. So if you're going to be gutting some pumpkins, make sure you save the seeds. You can roast them and eat them for a snack. Another helpful tip is freezing all of your veggie scraps. So collecting them in a little Ziploc baggie, putting them in the freezer. And when you have enough, making some nice veggie stock out of it, which you can also additionally store in your freezer or your fridge. The next is to batch cook and freeze meals. So there are a lot of meals that lend themselves well to being frozen or being stored for a long period of time. So thinking about using your fresh produce in these manners to help preserve it and help make it last for longer. And another thing you can do is freeze fruits to preserve them. Something that I really like to do when I notice my bananas are getting a little ripe and mushy is I'll either freeze them and use them in smoothies, or I'll put them in the fridge and try to make some banana bread or some banana baked goods out of them. And that's one way I can kind of save my bananas without wasting them. And finally, it does come down to the grocery list. So this is a sample grocery list I wrote for myself since I'm going to be moving back to school and I'm going to need to do some grocery shopping. So try to split it up into different categories. So for example, you have your bulk buys, things that I can buy in bulk, can buy a large packet of because I know it'll last me for a while. So those would be things like dried chickpeas, some rice, red lentils, whole grain pasta, rolled oats, quinoa. Then I'm thinking about the fresh produce. These are things that I might be getting every week, every 2 weeks. And that's basically produce that I need to be cognizant of how much I'm buying because I might not be able to sustain it for a long period of time. So things like bananas, mushrooms, apples, things like that. And then you can look at frozen varieties of food. So things like frozen broccoli, frozen berries, frozen beans. These I could also potentially buy in bulk because I know that they'll last me a long time. And splitting up your list that way is a great way to kind of categorize what you're going to be buying and plan so that you can shop sustainably and you can actually make the best out of your food. So just a quick summary of everything we've talked about today. So approximately 79 kg of food is wasted per household in Canada a year. Plant proteins are more sustainable than animal proteins. Being sustainable on a budget can be done by planning your meals and shopping local. And finally, you can reduce your waste with storage and preservation techniques. So thank you so much for listening to our presentation today. We'd really love it if you could share some of your tips for sustainable cooking. And if you have any questions, you can definitely email us at drkearney232@gmail.com. If you're interested in learning more about healthy cooking and diets, you can definitely check out our YouTube series. We also do have a Sunday dinner cooking group that meets once a month on Sunday afternoons. And you can also sign up to join that group if you're interested in learning more.